So what about that? I mean, you're not just an oil person, an energy person. You're an economist as well. Does the price of oil where it is and the fact that it's not been doubling, does that give you some reassurance on the recession issue?
Well, the fact that the oil price has been going up and down, of course, in response, really it's been a register of fears in terms of whether Iran is going to come back to the oil market or the trade war. But there are other indicators. We just had our Ihs Markit's latest PMI index for manufacturing. It's back to the level that you haven't seen since 2009. So obviously there are a lot of things going back and forth. I think oil is it was the inventory numbers that boosted oil today, and oil has been kind of in this range.
Well, what about those inventory numbers? Because they did surprise, and they did, as you said, really drive up the price of crude oil. Is that a structural issue? Is that something, or is that just an aberration?
Well, I think it refers to the fact that in some ways the market has gotten tighter. But what is the dominating theme in the oil market, if you remember, David, in May, when it looked like the U.S. and Iran were going to be going at it, oil got up to $75 a barrel. And then things switched to really what you're talking about, fear of recession, and that's what pulled down the price. And the oil price is actually one of the things that's not today, but has generally been reacting to this pervasive trade war that continues.
So it's sort of on the one hand, supply, Iran cut down the supply. On the other hand, demand, there's a concern about China in particular, but global demand overall.
We've seen our numbers for demand were lower than others, but people have come down to sort of a 1.1 million barrel a day increase. And the other thing that's going to happen in the next few months is we're going to see a significant increase in U.S. oil production. We'll get up, I think, by the end of the year to around 13 million barrels a day or more, because these pipelines that have been under construction to move surplus oil or extra oil from the Permian area to the coast are now coming online between August and the end of the year, and the ability to move another 2 million barrels a day. So one of the features of this new world is that the U.S. is really an oil powerhouse as an exporter.
Well, talk about those pipelines. There was something of a chokehold, basically, on getting the oil out of the Permian, and we needed more pipelines. When President Trump came in, one of the things he said is we're going to deregulate to permit one of those pipelines. Does the Trump administration deserve some of the credit for the increasing flow of oil out of the Permian?
Well, not out of the Permian. I think elsewhere they've tried to bring the Keystone pipeline and to finally get that. That's been on the dock since 2005. But I think in the Permian, it's all in Texas, and it's a lot easier to do things in Texas than across other state borders. So it's really been driven by the economics, by the market, and the need to get to the ocean so that we can export these growing volumes.
Address another area in the country, the United States, which is Alaska. We just heard that the BP apparently is going to be selling off its operations up in Alaska. They're pulling out of Alaska, essentially, selling to somebody else. What does that tell us about some of the deregulation ability to drill up in Alaska?
Well, what they're doing is getting out of their traditional areas. Alaska is kind of beginning to have a mini boom. People are going back and discovering other oil. And I think for BP, it's been in Alaska for over a half century. From their point of view, the volumes are going down. They have a lot of developments in other parts of the world where they need to put capital in. And they just did a big acquisition, actually, that got them in a significant way into the Permian. So they're saying this is a legacy asset, let's move on. And it's a classic thing where the company that's going to buy it is one that specializes in older assets and kind of managing them in a different way. So, but Alaska is a state that depends upon oil revenues to a very significant degree.
So, Dan, put two things together if they fit at all. On the one hand, you said earlier that your review of the PMIs, the manufacturing PMIs, really were concerning. And that's true globally, by the way, not just the United States, about people call it a manufacturing recession. On the other hand, with the price of oil low, that helps consumers. And consumer numbers in the United States basically have held up. What is the risk that the one will migrate into the other? And that is to say, the manufacturing recession, if it is, could actually migrate over to the consumer side?
Well, I think if we start to see a slowdown in jobs, people get more nervous. Companies, part of what that index does is tell you companies are not spending, not investing at the same degree. And so it kind of, one flows into the other. But I think that, it's still true that the driving part of the U.S. economy, the largest part, is the consumer. And if the consumer keeps spending, that's what keeps us from a downturn. And by the way, David, people think that China is very vulnerable to trade, but it's striking to see the change in China, too. In 2006, China, 65% of its GDP was from trade. It's now down to 38%. And I was just looking at our numbers for economic growth in China last year. 75% of it was driven by domestic consumption, which says that China is maybe not as vulnerable to this trade war as some people think.
It's a terribly important point, I think, Dan, because going into this, people thought China had more to lose than the United States did, in part because it perceived that more of their economy was dependent upon trade. As they come down closer to where we are with our economy, it's not as clear, is it, that in fact going to war over trade with China will hurt them more than it hurts us.
Well, I think that's right, that you'll see that, they have lowered tariffs with other countries, a lot of their trade in Asia and in Europe. And I think something else that's important that's been kind of lost sight of. On October 1st is the 70th anniversary of when Mao Zedong stood at the gate of heavenly peace and said, the Chinese people have stood up. The century of humiliation is over. I don't think that Xi Jinping in this period can appear to be weak, particularly when he has this other issue going on, which is, of course, Hong Kong. So I think there may be an underestimation of how the Chinese see this, and they're not going to be humiliated.
Dan, one of the things we've seen as a result of the trade tensions or war with China is a real effect on farmers in this country. But it's come back actually into more your area of energy as well, because as you know, there was a meeting in the White House where farmers were very upset about biofuels. And now there's a headline that's just crossed the Bloomberg as we've been talking, saying that Trump officials developed details of a plan to boost biofuels. How big a help could that be for farmers?
Well, it's something that could be particularly important, particularly in the state of Iowa, which is a critical state. So biofuels are something farmers are certainly in favor of. It kind of complicates our refining system, and so it's been a controversial issue. The other thing that sort of hung over the oil market was the thought that, in that weekend when President Macron of France has been so busy and brought the Iranian foreign minister to the G7, or to the outskirts of the G7, that Iranian oil might come back into the market soon. But I think the indications are, as much as President Trump might want to have a victory with Iran, the politics of Iran don't make it easy for them to come around and sit down and negotiate. I was struck that 100 members of the Iranian parliament said to sit down with Trump now would be poison, and poison was language that the Ayatollah Khomeini used in the Iran-Iraq war to talk about a ceasefire. So it's not, and you could see that President Rouhani changed from one day to the next because he's not the decision maker there. It's the supreme leader. So it's not going to be easy to resolve this crisis, no matter how eager President Macron is to show that he's the new Angela Merkel of Europe, and how much the Trump administration might like to have a victory.